Okay, this lecture is going to be on the topic of the market assessment, site selection, another terminology sometimes used, feasibility study. This is the before in terms of the convention venue that we're talking about here. What we have to do to prepare, with next week being our discussion about the actual design. And what we're going to cover here is determining whether to build or not, potential demand, how we measure it, and go through some various methods on that. Then what should we build in terms of size and so on. Where to build, the site selection itself, which is something you've seen in the case study, the Auckland, New Zealand case study that we'll talk about, and give you some examples as we go through it. Now this is something that should be familiar to you. We've already talked about this in the funding aspect. Again, coming from your reading, very important. I would highlight this and be able to answer these kinds of questions or determine what it is that we mean when we say 10 convention center questions about whether to build, who will manage, market, and so on. That's what we're going to try and answer in the context of today's lecture. Okay, determining the market. First, we've got to determine supply and demand. Whether or not there is a feasible amount of demand in order to justify what we're going to build. Determine occupancy. Excuse me. And when we're talking about occupancy in this context, for those of you who are hotel majors, you would know that determining occupancy of a hotel, Hong Kong, you might consider something in the neighborhood of 85% perhaps being a standard, but in terms of when we talk about convention venues, the numbers are quite a bit different. One main hall, you're going to have a major exhibition or even an event set up for a general session and so on. It takes time to set it up, it takes time to tear it down. Generally speaking, you think about every single day in the process in order to make that occupancy work. So when we talk about shows, we talk about dark days, and those are the days when we're regional meetings. What are the different characteristics that meet what our facility should have? So, and then of course there's some necessary properties, the total amount of space and area for the whole region. What do we have that we're competing against? I think one of the challenges that we'll talk later about when we talk hoping that they're going to get a market. But you have to think about what's there as a competitor, what's there within the region already. And then demand is occupancy. And occupancy here means total number of potential conventions and the Moscone Center in San Francisco, you realize that the San Francisco Giants only play there 80 days out of the year, so the rest of the time has to be sold for other type events. And then what can be achieved from the local population or the regional population in terms of the size for those type of events. In estimating occupancy, we're going to talk about 6 different methods. Essentially, the first method is a culmination of all of them, but you should know these and you should be familiar with which ones are which in the process. So let's talk about number 1, the prudent navigator. And what we mean here is a prudent navigator will not solely rely on any single aid to navigate. So the number 1 method is essentially a combination of the other 5 methods in the process. So we avoid the single method aspect. We use more than one type of research aspect. We use logic and accuracy of analysis, and we make assumptions that are reasonable, plausible, logical, and sustainable, documented by all of the aspects. So a prudent navigator is one that uses all systems. That's an important concept to think about. So the first of those possible systems is just historical trends. Now this works well when you have an existing facility, looking at past attendance, occupancy, especially if you want to expand, or if you want to build new within a region where there's an older facility that already exists. But if you're building new in a new location, then historical trends may not be quite as relevant to you in the process. But if we look at things from a historical standpoint, one way to look at this is overall, if you look at the destination that you're thinking about. And now you look at, here's the top international meetings. So if we're after international meetings, historically, what do we know? We know that the U.S. comes out on top, and Singapore is number 2, interestingly enough. Of course, as we've talked about, Singapore is a small place, only 4 million people. So if they have a meeting, it's going to be international. So basically, they count virtually every meeting as an international meeting. China, you see down here at the bottom in number 18. Top international meeting cities. Again, of course, Singapore, number 1. Brussels, Paris, Vienna. You don't see the U.S. come in until number 18. But again, I caution you that these numbers, when they talk about international meetings, that there are so many large national and small portion international meetings in the U.S. that it doesn't really figure too well in the comparison here. But what we're saying is we're using these statistics to look at historical information. So if we're looking to compete within Asia in our city, what do we know about the number of meetings? Singapore, we see Seoul, we see Tokyo. What do they get per year? What do they accomplish per year? What's a good number for us then in whatever city we're talking about? Again, international meetings per city in 2009, you see Vienna coming out on top. Barcelona. Again, Vienna, a small country, Austria. Basically, any meeting they have is going to be an international meeting. In Singapore, you see number 5. Hong Kong all the way down at number 24, but that's still rather impressive for a small place like us here in Hong Kong. Number 3, or the second method basically, is user surveys. Now, you know, when we think about this in our context as SHTM, and I'm sure you've heard this in other courses and other classes you've had, is we think more about academic type research, statistically reliable figures, quantitative, qualitative research. I think one of the challenges you have with the way a lot of these studies are done, including the one that you're reading for Auckland, New Zealand, is that they just look at general numbers and they don't necessarily look at the statistical reliability of those. So, for example, is a rating on a particular amenity that a facility should have of 4.5 greater than 4.4? Well, yes, but is it statistically significantly different? If you look at confidence intervals, it may not be. So it may be a big challenge in that process of things. But we can also incorporate qualitative information and talk to the buyers. You know, talk to the buyers. Do surveys out there. That's why I say, who should be surveyed? And your answer should be, what about convention organizers? What about attendees? You know, we don't see any of that in the Auckland, New Zealand case, do we? So this is a potential fatal flaw in the process of how many surveys might be done if they haven't considered those kind of things. On the other hand, I've seen facilities advertise within their message that one of their keys is that they got buyer input, they got buyer involvement. Let me catch up with my notes a minute here in front of me. I know I'm pausing in a recording, an unusual occurrence, right? Okay, the fourth method is looking at similar centers and similar markets. Of course, if you're building something new, this is probably the first thing that you would fall back on is what do we know in the area around us? And really, who's our competition? This is an area sometimes where we get a little aggressive and we think about everybody, every possible alternative as being a competition. So, for example, think of our own hotel Icon here. Who's the competition? Is Kowloon Shangri-La competition? Ritz-Carlton competition? See, I think not, actually. I think we're in a different category than they are. Size, type of facility we have. I think if you compare to those directly, that may not really be the competition or how the customer sees it. It really should be in the customer's perspective. Here's an example from your case study that you can take a look at more thoroughly. And when they're looking at Auckland, look at all these things. And I'm going to refer to my notes over here to see this. You look at all the places that they talk about and when they were built. I mean, this is a rather hard chart to follow to begin with because some of these facilities were built before '97, but they've been added on to. You see Singapore Expo on there a couple of different times because of expansions and so on in the process. But is that really realistically, are these really all competitors? Do we really think that Bangkok is a competitor here in Osaka? You know, I'm not sure. And I'm saying that maybe they put every possibility on here, and maybe we're not necessarily talking about those that are indeed the real likely competitors in the situation. Maybe it's more regional competition because rotation means they're thinking of our region within Asia. Yet another method is looking at market share. This is a good test to see how many activities do we get per our venue compared to others. That sometimes can be a good barometer. What are the types of other venues in the area in terms of those number of activities? Making a comparison here of what our percentage of the market is. In fact, I know that hotels spend a lot of time on market share analysis, and there are companies like the Smith Travel Research people that specialize in this area in particular. Now, this chart here is not really designed to think about an individual facility, but if you look at the number of meetings and you break this down by region of the world in terms of what you're after, if you're after meetings from Europe, obviously this is where the largest percentage is, according to ICA numbers. You see Asia at 18%, North America at less than that. So if you're thinking about these regions of the world, think about New Zealand, only 4% come from Australia. So where are we going to get those meetings in the process of things? That's a way to look and make our own comparison. Yet another method is industry growth. You know, looking at the increase in number of events, either that we expect to get or that we've seen other like facilities, for example, doing. Increase in annual attendance, event days, room nights. This is a big thing, of course, right? Because how are they funded? They're funded by hotel guest room taxes, so we need to think about that. And of course, a regional explanation or justification is an important one with regards to thinking about full-time equivalent employment. So, thinking about all these things, then, the question is, if we feel through all of these aspects, perhaps using the prudent navigator aspect, what should be built after we think about whether it should be built, whether it's feasible in the process, what should be built? Well, we have to optimize the facility. We have to make sure that we build the most appropriate space and the best use of the venues. You know, today you see a tremendous amount of change going on, especially in mainland, that we'll talk about in the China development aspect in particular, of moving from pure exhibition hall to exhibition and convention facilities. So how large should those facilities be? Are they being built large enough? But if we build them too big and then we don't use them effectively, that's an opportunity for us too. You know, in the Christian religion, sometimes they think about, they have the terminology, well, they'll say you don't build a church for Christmas and Easter. In other words, you don't build it for the 2 days of the year when most people come. You have to build it for what's practical. So we need to look at the maximum amount of potential delegates in the square meters for all of that. And this is an interesting job. And sometimes we come up short and then we end up having to add on. And I'll talk about a case study at the very end with regards to my old hotel, the Marriott World Center, in that very situation. Facility considerations, as I mentioned, when we think about exhibition space. Now, what's an exhibition? An exhibition just simply needs a concrete floor, high ceilings, you know, open ceilings, steel walls. I mean, these are the things you see there. But, you know, what's the mix of equipment or utilities that we have to build in. You know, if you have a clear space, you have to be able to build into the floor the type of facilities, utilities that are needed, such as air and water and electric and telecommunications and so on. And are we thinking about it from the future? Because we can't just tear the floor up and put something in new when we're doing it. And what's the floor load? You know, if it's on a ground floor, that's one thing. But if it's an upper floor, the Las Vegas Convention Center upper floor has the same kind of weight load as the ground floor, and an incredible achievement architecturally to do that. Number and size of pre-function areas. We'll talk about that a little bit. Pre-function area sometimes is thought of as an area that's not revenue producing, and that can be a real challenge. Meeting room characteristics. The growth and the need for this is important, and the flexibility of it. But yet, when we start putting in dividing walls, as we have even in our classroom, then we think about, well, how's the soundproofing between the two rooms? What kind of finishes? You know, are we building a ballroom with luxurious carpet, or are we building a solid floor? You know, when we were opening the Marriott World Center in Orlando, the initial first plan, they told us we would have an exhibition type facility that would have roll-out carpeting. In other words, it would roll the carpet up on a roll and take it out. And about a year or so before we actually opened and I was in the pre-opening for 3 years, by the way, the design people from our head office came to me and they said, we just saw your video, and your video indicates this roll-out carpet, and we were thinking about that. And do you have any idea how large that roll would be to roll out carpet for a 47,000 square foot ballroom? I said, no, that was your job. And they said, well, can't be done. So they thought, well, okay, we'll put in these carpet tiles. And I said, oh, that's not going to work, you know, for a ballroom. Well, you know, what happened is Bill Marriott went out and he made the decision to put in fine English woven carpet. And therefore, we had to go back to the exhibition company we were working with and say, look, you know, these things are supposed to be on a concrete floor. Well, now we got to put plastic visqueen down on the floor underneath it, and you need to go back and talk to the exhibitors about this, and you have to be very careful about it. Well, it created all kinds of challenges. We also think about the walls and the exteriors, and we're going to have chandeliers, those kind of things. These are the things you see when you see, we talk about the China development, and we talk about the China National Convention Center. These are things you'll see there. And is it a single purpose for that banquet or plenary session, or can they be multiply used? In case of China National Convention Center, in fact, their ballroom and even their plenary session room in the early stages were used for exhibits, but they had to put down a covering on the floor for that. Excuse me. Look at pre-function space here. Take a look at these photos. As I mentioned, sometimes this can be an oversight, that we don't think about this. Because you think about within the walls of those rooms you see there is the rentable space. The pre-function area, on the other hand, is not always rented. And so it's the area where you do registration, but it's the area where you also do cocktail receptions, where you can have different types of exhibition booths, stands, say for educational purposes and so on. So a lot of times this is overlooked and not built large enough, but you have to be able to accommodate the same number of people you put in the room, but maybe in a standing position for cocktail reception. When I get to talking about the World Center in the end here, we'll talk more about that and what happened in terms of Orlando. But if you think about this, one of the facilities I think that I've seen that has done the best job in this is the Marina Bay Sands in Singapore. What you see is indoors, and the figure on the left is upper left is sort of similar to this. You have a large amount of space indoors, but then outside that wall, and outside they have this huge deck. Of course, Singapore is nice year-round, although warm, so they have the ability to do that. This is a diagram that some of you in the scavenger hunt will become more familiar with. HKCEC. Now here's a multi-level facility. Remember before we talked about which ones in the U.S. were multi-level, single-level, most single-level. Now this diagram looks rather complicated, but if we have something on the first floor, exhibit hall, and we need to use the grand hall on a higher level. How do we get there? You know, do we use escalator systems, and how quickly can we move people from place to place? And what's our floor load on each of those areas? That has to be put into consideration here. Other considerations that are the positive factors when we think about building a convention venue have to be this catalyst to the city. You know, make something happen, re-imaging the city. That's one of the reasons that Moscone Center was built where it was in San Francisco. Didn't used to be a very attractive area. Now that area has grown up around it, and it's a very in place to live within San Francisco itself. Substantial economic and tax benefits can be brought in to the city. That's a big factor. These are things you might want to think about if you were asked whether or not you were going to build, even if it lost money. And then external factors that you have to consider. Contractual obligations. If you're in a location in North America or Europe where unions are very strong, what are the obligations to the union, and what unions are you dealing with? Weather and environment. Are you in a location where you're able to use outdoor type facilities? And if so, how do you take advantage? The Hawaii Convention Center is a magnificent facility in Honolulu, and very open air with palm trees and so on. A lot of area to the pre-function areas within the meeting space. I've been there several times, including last June when I was speaking at a conference. And you know, it's a great facility to meet in, and you feel like you're in Hawaii. Political and economic factors. You know, not everybody is in favor of these, as we mentioned before, so we have to consider that. And this aspect of building facilities for one event. You know, those of you who might choose to do Shanghai World Expo Center or the China National Convention Center, these were built for one purpose. They have been turned into multi-purpose facilities now that are going to be practical, hopefully in the long run, but is that really the right way to do it? What about the bird's nest? Is the bird's nest practical for other facilities? You know, it's not very good for a North American or a European football game, for example. Fans are too far away because there's a big track, you know, running track that circles it. So it's tough to use from other facility standpoint. But thinking about the city itself as a catalyst, this is important about thinking about the prosperity of the city. You have direct effect. Okay, that's the direct expenditure, the number of jobs and taxes that are directly associated with it. But oftentimes the justification comes more from indirect effect. In other words, as I think I mentioned earlier, you have an employee of, let's say, a hotel connected to the convention center who goes out and spends their money in the local grocery store. You know, that's one form. And then you have a further one when that employee of that local grocery store, let's say, decides to take their family out for a dinner at McDonald's in the local community, and so on, you know, and how much of that is really there. And then you think about this leakage that we talk about when expenditures don't come back to the city itself. This is a classic example in San Jose, California, where I was. San Jose borders Santa Clara, and they're next to each other. Now, the airport there services both. And here's the challenge sometimes. When you have a conference meeting in downtown San Jose, they fly into the airport there. Some go to the downtown hotels, but some choose to stay in the Santa Clara hotels. Well, if they're staying in the Santa Clara hotels, even though it's close proximity, then there's no tourism occupancy tax coming to San Jose to fund those facilities. It's going to Santa Clara instead. So as a result, the attendee is using facilities that you might say they're not paying for. And so that's what we call by leakage. So as hotels and others grow outside of that particular city, metropolitan area itself, there may very well be some leakage of that. So this is a question that I want you to think about. We'll talk about this in class as well. Do we need more venues in Hong Kong? Why? What type? Where? It's a big debate. You know, the Hong Kong CEC is essentially landlocked. Can't grow any further. So there's talk of building more facility because of more demand, but where? And those that think about Wanjai, it's not connected. It would be in a separate aspect, so a separate location. So how do we get the people back and forth, and what does that accomplish? If we think about AWE, there's probably more room to expand out there, but if I took a poll of you in this class, all of you from Hong Kong, you would say AWE is like in another world. But if you took a poll of people who came from elsewhere, they might not agree with you. In fact, during the scavenger hunt, one of you might be asked, one of your groups might be asked to find out how long it takes to get to a hotel in Central from AWE. And then another might be asked how long it takes to get from a Disneyland hotel there. And you might be surprised at that comparison. But I won't give that away. All right, let's look at the site selection process. Take a break for a minute and catch up to my notes. When we think about this, we need to look at the criteria, how we evaluate it, the acquisition issues, what kind of decisions do we make in terms of that development, when it's a win-win versus a lose-lose situation, and ultimately what the negative impacts are. All these need to be considered. Now here's an example of HKCEC when they were looking to expand to where it is now. And you'll see, as I get my note here in front of me, what you'll see in the circled areas is the project itself, okay? It talks about modifying it in the same airspace. In other words, the advantage here is you don't have to go out and put any more reclaimed land. In the benefits section, look at the highlights, what the first year of operation is, including the number of jobs, and then looking at it over time up to 2025. And then the key considerations. Number one, no reclaimed land, no additional roads, no significant visual impact, and no burden on the taxpayers. Big factor, no burden on the taxpayers. These were all part of the justifications for where we were led to the approval for what is now built on in terms of the addition. So when we think about convention centers, once again, we think about the same thing that we think about for a hotel. I'm sure those of you who have had any hotel course have heard the term location, location, location. So in this case, when we say marketability of the facility, we mean the amount of attendance and the occupancy. You know, where's the center going to be in terms of its location to bring that in? Where is the site located within the overall destination? What location is it in relationship to surrounding market areas? And you see this in your case study that we'll talk about in class, your New Zealand case study. So let's look at an example here, a hypothetical example of how we might go about qualitatively, if you will, making some comparisons. And there's several different examples here. There's several different pages of this. Let's assume that we're looking at, in this case, we're looking at a total of 5 locations. Think about this. How many in the case of New Zealand were you thinking about? And how did they evaluate them? Here you see they're looking at it from the standpoint of the physical characteristics, market characteristics, financial feasibility. And they've rated them. Okay, they've rated them on a scale of 10 for each one to come up with the number of points. So this is a group of experts looking at this, evaluating it, making some judgments on a qualitative basis. And if you look at this, Site C would be the choice, right? Total number of points, Site C, with B falling second and D third in terms of the overall aspect. All right. Now, let's take that a little bit further. Let's look at some of the parts. In this case, now we're looking at just the development criteria, the potential for joint operation, the impact on surrounding use, and so on, and how important it is, and which site there is. And what you see here is that Site A, essentially, in this case, as looking at it, becomes as eliminated. Okay, and here Site C comes out as number 1. So we go back to our original. We look at that, and that was also Site C. So Site D comes out number 2 when we look at some of the development criteria. Okay. And that note's here in front of me again. Sorry. Okay, now how about marketing marketing criteria? Look at the destination appeal. We look at the proximity of headquarters, hotel, all these other aspects. Again, we're looking at this qualitatively. So we look across the different sites. Again, A is eliminated. C comes out 1, D comes out 2. So far looking for C, right? Okay, let's take another look. How about if we look at the key screening criteria such as the site size, adjacent roads, cost of land, interest by the landholder, all of that. Now, here, when we start looking at this particular criteria, now what we have is we have an example here where, in this case, D comes out ahead. D comes out ahead of C. So what's the decision going to be? It's not as easy and cut and dry. And in our case study, we're going to talk about that, okay? Which one should we decide on? Which one is most appropriate for our selection? So in that criteria now, we're looking at what's the size, what's the visibility, parking, parking's a revenue source, the physical, environmental issues we need to think about, as we'll talk about when we get into design, lead or environmental type issues, access, proximity, all of these are factors. In size consideration, what's the building footprint going to look like? How is it going to be designed so that we have the maximization of space? Where's the service access? One of the things that any of you who do Suntec in Singapore, for example, will find that the exhibition facility is actually on the 4th floor. So you have to go through a circular drive to get up there. Now that limits some equipment that can get in, so that could be an issue. Where parking is. Zoning regulations, in other words, is the government allowed for the building of this kind of facility there, or do we have to change where some might have been zoned as residential, for example? What's the future expansion? Again, what we find in HKCEC. I don't think the original builders of HKCEC anticipated where we would be today. And that's, as you'll see with the Orlando World Center, an example can happen. And required on-site circulation, landscaping, all of those kind of things, what we're going to have to do. Visibility and context. Here, what we're saying is, you know, prominent civic structure on the horizon. You're seeing more iconic buildings being built for the city, celebrating the civic pride. Ottawa in Canada is an example where they came back and built a facility of that nature to highlight the city. They need to blend in with the surroundings. I'll show you an example here, but something like in the Georgia World Congress Center in Atlanta, the Slope Moscone Center, the north and south facilities are built, most of it underground, so that they don't create any kind of a visual aspect in terms of the line of sight in the city. Here's the example that we're talking about in Georgia with the sloped roof and what it looks like in the process of things. Parking, as I mentioned, this can be a big revenue source, so we need to think about that, and local residents are concerned about this. How much of it, how much income can be there? Do we have to build into it later? Does it enhance the real estate value because we have local restaurants and other retailers in the area that can benefit from it? Use perhaps that facility when we're not using it? Oops, sorry. Physical and environmental costs to the downtown. What's the marketability? What's the greatest impact? Where is the increase in development costs for other developers in the area who get in early in the process of things? You know, what's going to happen to that in the region? Will it set off too much of an increase? Suburban area. If we choose to do it in a suburban area, we might have the land, room for vehicles, all that, maximum parking space, but then do we have the accessibility? Is it as easy to get to? Does it have the right kind of aspects there? So if we look at this in an overall aspect, we can see that, access is another factor. Getting ahead of myself here. More efficient for the local aspects of it, parking, all those things I've talked about already in terms of where we're at. The consumer shows being a big factor there. Proximity to supporting facilities. How about walking distance to hotels? Are they connected or not? You know, you have situations where a lot of times you build hotels, you want hotels, like we have here in Hong Kong with the Grand Hyatt and the Renaissance that are connected to the center, so you can go back and forth inside. But in a place like San Francisco, that was quite a political issue. So what you see there is you see the Moscone Center and the Marriott, for example, which is the #1 convention facility, not connected. You have to walk outside between the two facilities because no one in the city wanted them to have a competitive advantage. But the reality is, underground, the same supply entrance exists for the Moscone Center, the Marriott, and the Four Seasons Hotel. All of them have the same entrance. So underground, they're all connected. In fact, when you have VIPs that have high security aspect, they take them underground internally. But you and I, walking out on the street, we don't see that. So we have to capture the full impact of delegate spending in the area, and meeting planner surveys. One of the biggest things they talk about is lack of supporting facilities. And one of the reasons why we want to build them, of course, is that we want to have those planners choosing us. In San Jose, we had a challenge with shopping downtown, for example. Proximity to other supporting facilities is important here, and if you look at that whole aspect you see here, you look at the investment in the convention center, you look at new jobs, tax revenues, new commercial development, all of that has to feed into the economic development of the city. A good, simple chart and graph to be able to put this into perspective. Another chart here to show you that comes more from the tourism side, and looking at this model, you have both a competitive and a comparative advantage. So maybe I have an advantage over my competition that I have something they don't have. That's a competitive advantage. You know, I have a ballroom and they don't. They just have an exhibition facility. Or it could be a comparative advantage. I have a larger facility. I have a better access facility. Okay, that could be where we're looking. And if you look at this overall, excuse me a minute, I'll get my note in front of me here. Okay, find it amongst my notes I've already put aside. I want to take a look at this chart that you're seeing here in front of you. Okay, sorry. Now, what you see here is for the destination to be competitive and sustainable in this competitive and comparative aspect, we go through these various steps from the micro and macro aspect. So we have to look at supporting factors. We look at the core resources that we have. We have the destination management. Who's going to do the marketing, the organization, and so on. The destination policy and planning. And then the qualifying and amplifying of those determinants. Okay, what about our location, our safety, our security? What makes us better than the competition? Okay, this is a good kind of graph to say what takes us from the broad to the narrow, the micro to the micro to be successful. In a site evaluation, we have some primary criteria, such as the size and configuration. We have secondary criteria, okay, the amount of parking, convention class hotels within the area. And then we have the tertiary aspect, which is things like acquisition cost, ease of site, clearance. You'll see all these in the case study, the New Zealand case study. Another way to depict this graphically is looking at the proposed site. First, we have to have an invitation to identify and nominate candidate sites through public announcement. These are the facilities we're looking at, sites A, B, C, D. That's what that facility in Auckland is doing. Identify more than one site. Look at the purchase site evaluation. Have a backup plan should the original not be satisfactory in terms of what we make our decisions on. Some acquisition issues, though, might be temptation to save dollars by selecting a less expensive site, which might not be the best and most appropriate area for us. Minimizing costs through creative approaches, getting other developers involved, selling air rights. You know, we see a lot of these facilities today put names of major sponsors on them. Think about football stadiums in Europe, and what about Etihad or Emirates? Who are the teams associated with those facilities? In the U.S., you see a number of those facilities where they sell air rights. That can help minimize the cost, offset that aspect of it. If we announce the site too far in advance, there could be speculation, could lead to some issues. There might be some political issues, those who don't want things in their region or want them in their region, if you will. This is back to thinking about acquisitions of Disney in Orlando, for example. When they first started to buy up the land there, They didn't tell anybody locally about it, what they were doing, and they bought it sort of clandestinely because they didn't want anybody to be speculating and raise the price on it. So we have to have some creative solutions, creating value through rezoning, making sure that we get urban development from agricultural aspect. We have to look at the entrepreneurship in terms of what we're talking about in HKCEC, for example, is the right to own and develop given from the government to the HKTDC to actually operate it, and leverage the award of professional contracts in terms of building and support facilities to get the best possible deal. Some of the negative impacts, well, we might be looking at moving residents, and this can be a problem. You think about the Hong Kong, Zhuhai, Macau Bridge, for example, what we've gone through here. Loss of affordable housing. We're tearing down that. Where are we going to put those people? Where are we going to relocate them? Pressure on increasing density, bringing more people to a downtown area that's already congested with traffic and so on. And increased cost of living in the area, which might mean that some people have to leave. They can't afford to live there anymore. Excuse me. Okay, let me give you an example, case study here. And then we'll talk about the New Zealand one in class. Let's go back to my old hotel, Marriott World Center in Orlando. And what you see here today is very different than when we started. Here's the facilities that you see today. 4 ballrooms, essentially. 1 major exhibition hall and 3 ballrooms. But that's not how we started. You know, when we first got there, we had a plan for 2 ballrooms and the sizes I'll talk about in a minute. And what happened is, about 6 months or so into our pre-opening, 2.5 years before the hotel opened, there was discussion being built across the interstate highway from us on Disney property of a Sheraton hotel. And the Sheraton hotel was going to have bigger ballrooms. So Bill Marriott came back to us and said, our sales staff, at that time we were about 6 or 7 of us, and they said, you know, what's the situation? And we were able to show them that we had about 20 or so groups that we hadn't been able to do business with because they needed more space. Now, in the very beginning stages, you see, the thinking was we were only about 10 minutes down the interstate highway from the convention center, which is now, you know, one of the top 3 largest ones in the United States. So we figured we didn't need that much space because the center had it. But as organizations grew, and associations particularly in North America, there was a need for more and more space. So they came back to us as the sales team in the pre-opening office, and they said, could we justify it? And my team justified it. I wasn't so sure, but they proved that indeed it needed to be done. So they gave us the opportunity to help design the space. So you see the 2 on the lower left side, we actually designed that and the pre-opening space in front of it. Some of the best pre-function space. And that pre-function space, some of the best of any hotel of its time, and still probably to this day, because we were able to design it as salespeople. We knew how that would sell in the process. But these are the 4 ballrooms that are there today. So let's look at how it happened over time. When I got there in 1983, we had 1,500 guest rooms and 2 ballrooms, one of 25,000, one of 30,000. Now those were big, by the way. Those were big. But that whole potential competition, and by the way, that Sheraton never was built there, but because Sheraton sued Disney when the plan fell apart in Lake Buena Vista, and they felt that they should be closer to Epcot Center, and won as a result, Disney had to build the Swan and the Dolphin hotels today. That's where the Sheraton actually got built. But in 1986, when the hotel opened, still had 1,500 rooms, 2 ballrooms, but now they were 37 and 40,000 square feet. But since then, since I left, they continued to keep growing by reducing the size of the golf course that surrounds it, really. They now have 2,000 guest rooms. They have 4 ballrooms, the same original 37 and 40,000, but now a 50,000 and a 105,000 square foot ballroom, which is really an exhibition facility as well. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of what happens in the process of over time what you think is there, what you still need to go, and what you need to do in the process of things. And the thing about Marriott I give them credit for is they've always been bold enough to do this. Okay, the Auckland, New Zealand case study. We're going to discuss this in class, so I want you to be prepared for these questions that we'll look at, which is how do you make sure that a convention center is a good idea? What do they show you? Does it convince you in the feasibility study? What is the competition, and how do you know they are? So they show that graph that we talked about earlier here. Is that really the competition, and how do you know that? And then what are the most important factors in determining the size? What did they come up with as a size, and do you believe it? And how big should it be? Do you agree with them or not? So that ends the lecture on this topic, and we'll be discussing that further in class.